The Holy Gospel this morning is found in St. John in the 2nd chapter. Now on the 3rd day there was a wedding in Cana at Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there. Jesus and his disciples had also been invited to the wedding. When the wine gave out, the mother of Jesus said to him, "They have no wine." And Jesus said to her, "Woman, what concern is that to you and me? My hour has not yet come." His mother said to the servants, "I'll do whatever he tells you." Now, standing there were 6 stone water jars for the Jewish rites of purification, each holding about 30 gallons. And Jesus said to them, "Fill the jars with water." And they filled them up to the brim. And he said to them, "Now draw some out and take it to the chief steward." So they took it. Now when the steward had tasted the water that had become wine and did not know where it had come from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew, and the steward called to the bridegroom. And he said to him, "Everyone serves the good wine first, then the inferior wine after the guests have become drunk. But you have kept the good wine until now." Jesus did this, the first of his signs, in Cana of Galilee, and revealed his glory, and his disciples believed in him. The gospel of our Lord. You may be seated. It is always dicey to preach on the Gospel of John simply because no one, and I mean no one, has any idea what actually is going on in this Gospel. So to do so, one takes a bit of a risk at any time, simply because from the very beginning we have no idea what he's talking about. For example, he says on the 3rd day there was a wedding in Cana of Galilee. Well, what is the 3rd day? What does that mean? We have no clue. 3rd day of what? So there it is. There's a wedding. Jesus' mom got invited. Jesus and the disciples got invited too. And they run out of wine. And then somehow along the line between a small conversation between Jesus and his mother, which like most conversations between sons and their mothers, goes with mom forcing the son to do something the son doesn't want to do, but the son eventually does it because after all, it's his mom. He doesn't regret it too long, but eventually 30 years later, he learns to forgive her. So he changes some water into wine. Now, whether he did this because he was the Son of God or whether he did it because he had gone to Hogwarts, we don't quite know. Seriously, Hogwarts? None of you? Read some books. Watch a movie. Whether it was a magic trick, whether it was a miracle or a sign, as John calls it, I cannot say. I wasn't there. But I have this story in front of me, and apparently there was some water, and then it became wine. And that is what we will work with. But having said that, there is a lot within this particular story that intrigues me. But probably nothing intrigues me more than the fact that Jesus, when asked to change the water into wine, does so. But then he goes about making so much wine. So my question is, why does Jesus make so dang much wine? I mean, 30 gallons, roughly 5 bottles to a gallon, that's like 750 bottles of wine. Almost, even more than that. And there's only like 200 people tops at this wedding, and they're already drunk. I mean, Jesus could have got by with a couple of, he could have probably got by with the stuff we give you at communion. It would have been fine. So the question is, what possessed the Son of God that when given the opportunity to do this particular miracle, makes so much wine? And not only that, makes good wine. Because we all know how this works, right? We've all either been to a party or perhaps hosted a party where we've said to ourselves, we got to look good. So we clean the house. I remember when Chris and I were first married, for example, she said, "Can you clean the oven?" I said, "We have a self-cleaning oven." She said, "Clean the oven." I said, "Why?" She said, "Well, we're going out to dinner." I said, "Yeah, I know. That's why I'm asking. Why am I cleaning the oven?" She said, "Well, we may come back afterwards and bake something."
Well, do you want me to vacuum the drapes too in case we want to open those? But you do that, right? You're going to throw a party, you're going to have people over, you clean the house, you put on a good show. And part of putting on the good show is serving your best food first, your best wine first. We all do that. And then, when things things kind of go off into the late night, which many of you, if you've especially gone to college and tried that out, after a while you're just down to whatever's in the cupboard. So you're eating some old taco shells and drinking Schlitz. And now we know who went to college. We all do it, right? And of course, the steward, he goes to the bridegroom and says, the way the game's usually played, buddy, is you serve the bad stuff last, not first, like you did. Because this wine, this stuff that I just got, this is good. Now, I pity this poor bridegroom because he doesn't know what's going on. He's in the middle of a wedding. He just got married. He's not going to know what's going on for the rest of his life. And so now all of a sudden the chief steward comes up to him and says, what are you doing? And he's like, I don't know. She said, buy wine. I bought wine. I didn't know. So now you got to ask, all this going on, and there's Jesus standing in the corner with his disciples and his mom, a few of the stewards or the servants who had filled this and done this work with him. And they're watching these guests at the wedding start to drink wine, taking them right out of the stone jars of purification. And perhaps that's finally why Jesus performed this sign and miracle. Of all the things that are interesting in details of this particular story, perhaps none is more interesting than the fact that he chose those jars used for purification. Now, to remind ourselves, these jars hold the water that we need in order to make ourselves acceptable before God and our community. So whenever we find ourselves unclean, we have to use this water to cleanse ourselves so that God will find us pure and holy and righteous. So perhaps we've talked with somebody who's not Jewish. We have to wash ourselves. Perhaps we've eaten unclean food. We have to wash ourselves. Perhaps women have had their time of the month. They have to wash themselves. Perhaps we have a skin lesion or some other visible defect. We have to wash ourselves so that God will love us and find us pure, blameless, upright, and holy. And those jars stand as a symbol of the works righteousness we need in order to have God love us. And Jesus takes those symbols of our works righteousness and translates them into vessels of God's abundant grace. That perhaps what Jesus is showing us in this story is not that we have to somehow cleanse ourselves, that we have to somehow take these waters out of these jars and find a way in which we can dot all our I's and cross all our T's, make sure that all the details are fine and dandy, that we look good, that we are presenting ourselves right before God and each other. But instead, Jesus takes those very jars and fills them with God's unlimited grace, this time in abundant wine, the best wine anyone has ever had for you. The wine that literally never ends. Because had these guests at the wedding of Cana been willing to drink all that wine, in all probability, there would have been even more after that. The story of this miracle is not that there are only 1,000 bottles of wine, but there are unlimited bottles of wine. As long as there is water, there is wine. As long as God is around, there is unlimited grace. And no longer is our relationship with God established by us going to these waters and cleansing ourselves so that we are righteous before God, but now our relationship is God coming to us and giving us unlimited grace, unlimited wine that continues to overflow long after we've been drunk, on the grace of God. And it is grace upon grace, as John reminds us in the beginning of his gospel. It gets better and better and better, so that we do not have to suffer the slings and arrows of misfortune, but instead can receive the grace of God that flows like wine out of these stone jars to continually bless us. Now, I use as an example my own life. Now, please note that there are many who do not have these experiences, and I understand that. But for each of us, somewhere in our life, it has been grace upon grace. And although we have received these graces, there are in between them, of course, fits and starts of depression and despair, tragedy and loss. It is not rosy and perfect, but God's grace continually flows, continually pours out into our lives. 30 years ago, I had the best day of my life. I couldn't imagine a greater day. I got married. I thought this was the coolest thing in the world. You could find somebody who would do your laundry. Wonderful. I've since learned that there's more to it than that. But it was still the greatest day of my life until about 2 years later, when I had a child, my first child. I thought this was the greatest day of my life. Nothing gets better than this. This is absolutely wonderful. And she became a teenager, and I tempered my expectations. Greatest day of my life. And then 2 years after that, I had another child, and I thought, oh my gosh, it is just grace upon grace. And this one, I tried to hold back and didn't let her become a teenager, but I lost time. I couldn't imagine it. And then, just a year ago, my oldest daughter had a child. And something happened that was way beyond anything I had anything to do other than to just stand there and go, wow, how incredible. 30 years ago, I thought I had the greatest day of my life. It turns out that there are many great days in those last 30 years. And I assume there are many great days in the next as well. It is God's grace upon God's grace. And however it works in your life, whether you have been blessed by family or friends, whether you have been blessed by good health, or you have been blessed by a life that is filled with hope and promise, amidst all the despair and tragedy of life, remember, the whole reason why this miracle starts is the dude ran out of wine. He wasn't good at planning. In the midst of those tragedies, God does not stop and say you must become pure, but rather in the midst of those tragedies of life, God's grace flows even more. And the wine is even better than it was. You've lost somebody, the wine gets better. You're depressed and stressed because things aren't going the way you had hoped and dreamed, the wine gets better. You're frustrated and angry at yourself and others because the world isn't what it could be, the wine gets better. And what the disciples saw that day 2,000 years ago when they were with Jesus at Cana was that Jesus is not about making sure that your life is perfect. He is about making sure that you understand that God's grace never lets you down. That those waters of baptism are indelibly placed upon you so that every day of your life you are filled with the grace and mercy of Jesus Christ. And that the grace that comes from those waters of God flow into your life no matter how difficult it is. And when you come before this rail today to receive that body and that blood, it is precisely an indication that God is not done with you yet. And that whatever that week you've had brings to this rail, you leave it here. And you go back filled with the new wine, the good stuff. It was true for those disciples 2,000 years ago. And it's true for you today. Amen.